What would it feel like to wake up with the weight of an entire kingdom on your shoulders? Today, we're stepping into the shoes of a medieval English king. But don't expect luxury. His day was a chaotic chess match of power struggles, peasant unrest, and fragile alliances. Can you guess what his biggest battle was before even stepping outside his chamber? Stick around to find out. A medieval king's day didn't start with the soft chirping of birds outside an open window or the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen. No, it began long before the luxuries of breakfast or a quiet moment to himself. Even in the early hours, the realm was clawing at the edges of his chamber. Advisors, guards, and servants waited anxiously outside his door, each carrying new demands, crises, or whispers of intrigue. The moment his eyes opened, the weight of the crown settled back onto his head, figuratively speaking, for now. You might be imagining the king's private chamber as a lavish retreat, dripping with gold, soft cushions lining every surface, and perhaps a roaring hearth as the centerpiece. The truth? It was more practical than opulent. Yes, the bed would have been large, perhaps even towering, bolstered with layers of fabric, furs, and pillows, but it wasn't all that comfortable by today's standards. The heavy curtains around his bed weren't just for aesthetics. They helped ward off the chill of the drafty stone walls. This room, while private, was still very much a political space. People came and went here with purpose. It wasn't just where he slept, but where key decisions and private discussions might happen. Even his most intimate surroundings were layered with strategy. And mornings? They weren't peaceful at all. The king rarely had the luxury of lying in bed for a few extra minutes. Servants bustled in, bringing water for washing and preparing his clothing for the day. Guards stood watch just beyond the door, some itching to share urgent updates about the night's events. Advisors would be strategizing even now, ready to intercept him as he began his day. Decisions, big and small, awaited his attention, and he didn't have the option to delay. From the moment his feet touched that cold stone floor, the business of the realm demanded to be addressed. But before all that, the very act of getting ready was a performance in itself. Dressing a king was no simple matter, and it was rarely a private affair. A carefully chosen circle of attendants would assist him, each one holding a defined role. While it might seem that they were just helping him into his robes, there was far more at stake. Every move was steeped in ceremony, every item of clothing laden with political meaning. An audience of nobles or trusted advisors might witness the process, using the opportunity to gauge the king's mood, his health, or subtle clues about his intentions that day. Let's talk about the clothing. The king didn't just throw on whatever felt comfortable. His attire, piece by piece, communicated authority, alliances, and even religious undertones. A simple tunic? Hardly. His garments were symbols of who he was and the power he held. For instance, the fabrics were often imported and expensive. Velvet, silk, and wool, dyed in rich hues like deep crimson or royal blue, weren't just fashionable. They spoke loudly of wealth and access to rare goods. Certain colors, such as purple, were reserved exclusively for royalty or those granted special permission to wear them, making the whole palette of his wardrobe another reminder of his unique status. Jewelry, belts, and brooches weren't just decorative either. They served as signs of his alliances or familial connections. A ring might carry a crest symbolizing loyalty to a powerful house, or a pendant could remind onlookers of an important victory or sacred relic gifted by the church. Even a belt buckle embedded with a rare gem could spark whispers about the subtle political message hidden within. Each piece told a story or wielded influence beyond its surface beauty. And all of this, every choice, every fastening of fabric, happened in the company of others who had their own ambitions, opinions, and possibly schemes. Of course, there were morning rituals beyond simply dressing. Washing wasn't just about hygiene, it carried symbolic weight too. In some cases, this act could be turned into a public or semi-public display of humility and piety, meant to remind those watching that the king ruled by divine right. Cleanliness, in their eyes, wasn't just physical. It hinted at spiritual purity and readiness to lead the people. A basin of water set before the king might come with whispered prayers or blessings. If you're imagining a relaxing morning soak, think again. This was brisk, purposeful, and surrounded by at least a few watchful eyes. Every morning, choice was calculated. The very people assisting the king likely represented broader factions within the court. Who was chosen to stand close, to hand the tunic, or even to fasten a cloak could send ripples through the court. Such activities might seem small today, but they could hold considerable weight in a medieval world where proximity to power often determined one's future. As the final touches were made, perhaps the crowning addition of a signet ring, those watching understood the message being sent. The king wasn't simply stepping into his clothing, he was stepping into his role for the day. Authority had to be projected unequivocally, even in something as seemingly mundane as fastening a belt. The morning process was as much about solidifying his rule as it was about starting the day. So, what did all of this build toward? His first tasks, looming just beyond the chamber door, were no less political than the act of getting dressed. Early decisions or audiences often came with high stakes. A noble might seek answers about land disputes, an advisor could bring economic concerns, or troubling rumors from the countryside might demand his attention. Whatever awaited, it would require focus and strategy from the moment he left his chamber. The weight of authority didn't ease up for breakfast. It only intensified. Even the choice of who was granted an audience first could be a calculated move. Imagine the subtle tensions as a bishop waited to discuss church affairs while a baron lingered to push for more autonomy in his territory. Balancing these early interactions often set the tone for the entire day, and the king knew it. By now, you probably see the problem. While most mornings today feel like a groggy shuffle toward coffee, a medieval king's morning was a finely balanced dance of imagery, politics, and duty. Even the simplest tasks were loaded with meaning and often done under the gaze of others. In this world, there were no small actions. Every detail could influence how the crown was seen, respected, or even challenged. But if the morning was this tense, what awaited him in the council chamber? Let's just say, the real game was only about to begin. The council chamber wasn't just a meeting room. It was where power was wrestled for, tested, and sometimes lost. Imagine stepping into a room packed with some of the most influential and self-serving figures of medieval England, all while knowing that every pair of eyes in the room was analyzing your every word, gesture, even your pauses. For a king, the council wasn't about friendly debates or orderly discussions. It was a constant test of strength, diplomacy, and, let's face it, basic survival. The council itself was a varied bunch. On one side, you might see the grim-faced nobles who ruled over vast patches of land and armies, and who were always angling for more. More land, more titles, or sometimes just more applause for their egos. On another, the church was well represented, bishops and even archbishops sitting with a dignified air, likely reminding the king that his authority only existed because God allowed it. Then there were the advisors, usually chosen for their wit and intelligence, though plenty got their spots because they happened to be the cousin of some baron or bishop. Each figure in this room wasn't just serving the king, they were serving their own agendas, angling for influence, power, or protection. For the king, it was a strategic puzzle every time he entered the room. Who to elevate, who to placate, and who might be hiding a knife behind their back. And then there was the matter of managing all these factions. Keeping the barons happy often meant granting land or indulging their military ambitions, but that could put you in hot water with the church if these actions came at their expense. On the other hand, if you catered too much to the church, for instance, letting them collect taxes freely or appoint their own bishops, the nobles would whisper that you were weak or, even worse, too pious to rule effectively. Toss in the merchants and commoners, who were usually not in the council room, but whose needs bled into every decision being debated, and it sometimes felt like the king was trying to juggle angry cats, each with sharp claws and its own demands. The stakes of these councils were high. Discussions on taxation alone could spark chaos. Royal coffers needed filling, wars had to be funded, fortresses maintained, and royal entourages fed. But every tax brought risks. Raise taxes on the barons, and you'd hear rumors of rebellion brewing in some distant castle. Increase levies on the merchants, and you might choke the kingdom's economy. Squeeze the peasants too hard, and the next thing you know, there's an uprising burning through the countryside. A common example of such pressure was the hearth tax, a levy based on how many fireplaces one owned, which hit peasants particularly hard. Choosing which group to push without tipping the scales into revolt was a delicate, almost impossible balancing act. Let's not forget the decisions about war and peace. The council played a central role here, not as a collection of impartial advisors weighing pros and cons, but as a group with very personal stakes. A noble might clamour for war with France because he hoped to seize land across the Channel. A bishop, however, might urge caution, warning of the church's disapproval or the moral cost of unnecessary bloodshed. Meanwhile, an economy-minded advisor could argue both sides, depending on whether he thought trade would be disrupted or enriched by going to war. What was the king supposed to do when every voice offered a conflicting piece of advice, and the ones shouting loudest were also the ones holding armies at their backs? History gives us some vivid examples of the chaos that brewed in council chambers. In the mid-14th century, for instance, councils deliberated fiercely over whether Edward III should press his claim on the French throne, what eventually snowballed into the 100 Years' War. To some nobles, war promised prestige and profit. To Edward, it was about establishing his legitimacy and expanding his power. But not everyone agreed. There were intense debates, sometimes boiling down into shouting matches, as others feared the economic strain or political fallout of prolonged conflict. Some historians even suggest that the seeds of later unrest within England, civil wars and noble disputes, trace back to decisions made in council during these early years. Dissent within the council chamber didn't always remain there. Sometimes it spilled into rebellions, assassinations, or outright civil wars. A king who didn't know how to control his council might walk into a room one morning and find that the alliances he depended on had crumbled overnight. Perhaps a baron had allied himself with a rival house, or maybe a bishop had quietly drained royal support by withholding funds or preaching sermons questioning the legitimacy of the crown. In a world where loyalty was fluid and survival depended on strategy, the king had to be an excellent reader of people, always a step ahead, always calculating who might turn against him next. And what about those rare moments when the king's council actually rallied behind him? These alliances were often fragile and built on shaky foundations of mutual need. Nevertheless, they were essential. without the council's backing, no new laws could be enacted, no armies raised, and no treaties brokered. Even kings with iron fists, like Henry VIII centuries down the line, relied on these inner chambers to grapple with key problems, from military campaigns to succession issues. Compromise was often inevitable, though it came at the cost of someone's resentment. Interestingly, the structure of these councils often shifted with the king's preference. Some kings favoured large councils, involving a wide spectrum of voices, while others kept things more intimate, trusting only a select few. Regardless of the size, every council had the same core tension. It was less about guiding the kingdom and more about guiding the king. Each councillor tugging him in a specific direction, each hoping that his idea would carry the day. Ultimately, the council chamber shaped the kingdom's destiny every day, but not without cost. The king needed to emerge as more than a ruler with good ideas. He had to appear decisive, just, and in control, no matter how chaotic the debates had been behind those closed doors. His ability to read motives, play rivals against each other, and issue commands with confidence often determined whether the next move would be a success or a disaster. Every hour spent in that room could mean the difference between the crown holding onto its stability or its wearer losing it entirely. But council politics were just one part of the day. Next came the realm itself, rife with challenges no less daunting. What lay beyond the chamber doors, waiting for the king's next move? Let's take a step into another fire he had to manage. The economy. A medieval kingdom's economy wasn't some tidy ledger of numbers. It was a living, breathing beast that demanded constant feeding, and if it ever went hungry, rebellion was sure to follow. Managing this beast fell squarely on the king's shoulders, making economic governance one of his most critical and risky responsibilities. His every decision rippled throughout the land, from the smallest village ploughing its fields to the grandest merchant ship unloading its cargo. If he got it wrong, the kingdom didn't just falter, it crumbled. At its core, the economy was tied to land. Nearly everything depended on agriculture, which made managing land ownership and production central to the king's role. He controlled vast amounts of territory, much of which was parceled out to barons, abbots, or knights in exchange for loyalty or service. These grants weren't just acts of generosity, they were deals, calculated to keep power balanced and alliances intact. But land wasn't limitless. Decisions had to be made carefully, especially when disputes arose over who had the right to farm or own certain swathes of territory. If the wrong person was awarded land, or worse, the same plot was promised to multiple parties, resentment festered like an open wound, weakening the king's authority from the ground up. Of course, cultivating the land was just step one. The next challenge was getting the wealth of that land into the royal treasury. Taxes were the lifeblood of the monarchy, but also its greatest headache. One of the more infamous taxes was the hearth tax, a levy applied to every household based on the number of fireplaces they had. For peasants in their one-room huts with a single fire, this felt punitive, especially during harsh winters. Then there was scutage, a tax nobles could pay to avoid personally serving in the military. Sounds simple, right? Except it often enraged both sides. Cash-poor barons resented paying anything at all, while the kingdom's reliance on mercenaries instead of feudal levies carried its own risks, especially when those mercenaries came with questionable loyalties. Taxes always followed the same pattern, necessary to keep the kingdom running, but guaranteed to cause unrest if anyone believed they were unfairly targeted. And this wasn't just a theoretical risk. History is riddled with examples of kings who underestimated the strain taxes put on their people. In 1381, King Richard II faced the full force of that anger during the Peasants' Revolt. The rebellion flared when frustration over taxes and systemic inequality boiled over, leading to armed bands storming through towns and even marching on London itself. Though largely aimed at local officials and tax collectors, the violence underscored how directly the king's financial policies could endanger the throne itself. Richard managed to calm the revolt temporarily through promises and concessions, most of which were quietly reversed later, but the scars of that uprising stayed fresh for years. It was a glaring reminder of what could happen if taxation tipped into oppression. But taxation wasn't the only way wealth flowed into the royal coffers, or out of them. Trade played an equally vital role in the medieval economy, weaving together connections that stretched from the bustling markets of London to distant ports across Europe. The king had a hand in regulating everything, from customs duties on foreign goods to the tolls merchants paid to move their wares through English-controlled roads and waterways. For example, if a king wanted to replenish the treasury, he might raise customs taxes on imported goods like wool or wine. Sounds clever, but every decision came with trade-offs. Higher customs could enrich the crown, but they could also discourage merchants, disrupt trade routes, and hit local economies hard. Merchants wielding considerable influence, sometimes representing whole guilds, weren't afraid to push back when they felt squeezed too tightly. The challenges didn't stop at tax codes and tolls. Piracy was a constant threat, as well as storms, shipwrecks, and diplomatic disputes with rival states. All things a king had to consider when hoping trade would flow smoothly. Maintaining these networks often involved negotiating with allies, threatening enemies, or funding the construction of ships to protect shipping routes. In a world where commerce was fragile and unpredictable, the king's ability to foster and safeguard trade could mean the difference between prosperity and crisis. Of course, when trade didn't go well, or a poor harvest plunged the kingdom into scarcity, the king had to confront the realities of famine. In desperate times, a ruler might try to enforce price controls, distribute grain reserves, or restrict exports to ensure his people were fed. None of these options were perfect, and all came with risks. Price controls could anger merchants, while grain distribution favored some regions over others, breeding resentment. Even actions with the best intentions could backfire, showing just how precarious the balance truly was. A king wasn't expected to navigate all of this alone, thankfully. Economic advisors, often a mix of clergy, wealthy merchants, and bureaucrats, worked tirelessly to supply him with information. These advisors collected data through surveys, audits, and records submitted by local officials, painting a picture of revenue streams and trouble spots. But even with this help, decisions rested squarely with the king, whose reputation often depended on outcomes he couldn't fully control. That's the thing about ruling. When famine strikes or trade falters, it's hard to explain to angry subjects that the weather or circumstances beyond your reach deserve most of the blame. One of the trickier aspects of economic management was keeping the kingdom's currency stable. Coins in medieval England weren't just shiny bits of metal. They were tiny promises of value, and like all promises, they could be easily broken. Kings sometimes debased the currency, reducing the amount of precious metal in each coin to mint more money quickly. But this was a double-edged sword. While it filled the treasury in the short term, it often led to inflation and undermined the trust required for a stable economy. Merchants might refuse to accept debased coins, and peasants, already struggling to pay taxes, could find themselves paying more for necessities without seeing any benefit from the extra money in circulation. The overall picture, then, was of a system where every piece of the economic puzzle — land, trade, taxation, and currency — was interconnected. Any sudden shift risked sending shockwaves through the kingdom. Balancing the needs of different social groups only made things trickier. The peasants needed lower taxes, but the nobles wanted land and funds for their own ambitions. Merchants demanded stability for trade, but that might conflict with the nobility's desire for wars funded through levies or customs. Every decision could alienate one group while appeasing another, and yet the king's success or failure in managing the economy wasn't just about keeping the treasury filled. More importantly, it was about keeping people, from peasants in the fields to merchants around the royal markets, reasonably content. An impoverished kingdom could spell disaster, but a restless one was far worse. Economic management wasn't about numbers, it was about survival. As the king well knew, an empty coin chest might sting, but an empty belly started revolts. But the economy wasn't the only thing threatening the king's rule. There were enemies inside and outside the kingdom. If keeping money flowing required brains, staying alive in a world filled with power plays and conspiracies required an entirely different kind of strategy. In the medieval court, swords weren't always the deadliest weapons. Whispers, quiet, conniving, and relentless, could do far worse damage. A single rumor, one faint accusation, or even a misinterpreted glance could kick off a chain of events that ended in disgrace, exile, or execution. For the king, the most immediate danger wasn't always raging on battlefields or stirring in far-off villages. Some of the most menacing threats were seated right there at court, smiling at him over goblets of wine. Surviving this environment required more than brute strength or even sharp wits. It required constant vigilance, a strong network of informants, and, let's be honest, a pretty solid paranoia streak. At first glance, the royal court might appear like a finely tuned orchestra, a collection of nobles, advisors, and officials, all working together to ensure the kingdom ran smoothly. In reality, it was more like a pit of snakes. Every noble had their ambitions, every bishop their agendas, and even the most loyal-seeming advisors could be considering their next move in the chess game of court politics. The king, theoretically at the center of it all, often had to second-guess who was truly helping him steer the ship and who was planning to drill a hole in it below deck. And here's the kicker. The more powerful the king, the more elaborate the plots against him. Absolute power doesn't bring absolute security. It just paints a bigger target on your back. Take the case of Edward II, whose court practically redefined betrayal. Edward faced constant conspiracies from his discontented barons, who were already irritated by his close relationships with certain favourites, like Piers Gaveston. Gaveston wasn't just disliked, he was hated, with many in the nobility seeing him as a corrupting influence on the king. Secret meetings, coded messages, and alliances formed until the barons finally forced Edward to exile Gaveston. And that was the nice part of their plan. Gaveston's eventual capture and execution came shortly after. This wasn't just a personal tragedy for Edward. It was a loud reminder that no matter how high your station, betrayal in the court could hit you like a dagger to the gut, literal or otherwise. To combat these threats, medieval kings relied heavily on networks of spies and informants. You might think of spies as shadowy figures skulking through corridors, but in reality, many were just regular court members who kept their ears open and reported back what they heard. A loose tongue at a feast, or an ill-considered comment whispered in the wrong ear could easily make its way to the king, giving him the chance to act before plots gained momentum. but relying on informants had its risks too. Information could be exaggerated, misreported, or intentionally fabricated by someone looking to settle a personal score or topple a rival. Sorting truth from fiction took time, something the king rarely had in surplus. Trusted advisors, theoretically, were supposed to help the king make sense of the chaos swirling around him. However, trust was a somewhat flexible term in the medieval world. Advisors had their own connections, families, and debts to consider. A noble-born advisor might be loyal when it came to general governance, but could hesitate or outright defy the king if decisions affected his family's interests. Others might take advantage of the king's reliance on them, subtly bending decisions in ways that benefited themselves or their allies. The most dangerous type? Those who played the long game, building the king's trust over years only to betray him at the most opportune moment. And let's not forget the role of queens and royal family members. Marriage alliances usually involved politics more than love, which meant the queen or her family often represented the interests of foreign kingdoms or opposing factions. While some queens were fiercely loyal, others played a more cunning role in court intrigue, using their influence to outmaneuver rivals or shift the balance of power. Even royal siblings could become problems. Think about King John and his older brother, King Richard the Lionheart. While Richard was off crusading, John worked to build his own power base back in England, laying the groundwork for conflicts that would haunt his reign long after Richard's death. This constant atmosphere of conspiracy wasn't just exhausting, it was deadly. A failed plot didn't always mean safety for the king. The fact that there was a plot at all usually meant discontent among the nobility or dissatisfaction with the monarchy's direction. The biggest problem? Kings didn't have time to chase every whisper or punish every murmur of defiance. Acting too harshly could alienate allies. Ignoring the problem could leave openings for future rebellion. The challenge was knowing when to crack down and when to let things slide. And sometimes it meant issuing punishments, not because a plot was real, but because letting a fake one go unchecked made you seem weak. It's a lose-lose situation that no amount of crown jewels could fix. The stakes couldn't have been higher because court intrigue didn't just threaten the king personally. It threatened the entire stability of the monarchy. A coup wasn't just about replacing one guy with another. Successful conspiracies often triggered ripple effects, alliances breaking apart, regions rebelling, or neighboring kingdoms taking advantage of the chaos to invade or renegotiate treaties. A single betrayal in the court could destabilize everything, and medieval kings knew they could never fully trust anyone except, well, maybe their dogs. Even with all these risks, the king couldn't govern from the shadows. Public appearances were just as important as private deals. Every feast, speech, and ceremony was an opportunity to remind everyone who held the power. But these events were a double-edged sword. While they showed the king's strength, they also gathered the court's most dangerous players in one place. Every flickering torch and whispered comment felt like fuel for another conspiracy waiting to spark. The irony? The whispers kings feared most didn't always come from their direct enemies. Friends, allies, even family members could just as easily turn their backs when the opportunity arose. But what else could they do? In a world where power was both everything and never enough, loyalty was rarely unconditional. Sure, some nobles were loyal to the idea of the king, but that idea rarely extended to the man sitting on the throne. If they could profit from his downfall, well, let's just say it wasn't personal. It was politics. The court was a constant game of survival, Spies routed through whispers, advisors maneuvered for control, and alliances teetered on the brink of fracture. Surviving this environment wasn't about eliminating all threats. It was about staying one step ahead, outmaneuvering plots before they fully formed. Because in the end, every king knew this. The people in the court weren't just his advisors or nobles. They were his greatest rivals. While handling internal threats, the king also had to prepare for dangers across the borders, ones that carried swords instead of whispers. Let's talk about his role as the kingdom's military strategist. The king wasn't just the ruler of a kingdom. He was its shield, its strategist, and when needed, its sword. Defending a realm as vast and volatile as medieval England wasn't a secondary concern. It was a relentless responsibility that demanded every ounce of focus and cunning. Every castle, every soldier, and every scrap of diplomacy ultimately traced back to him. From dawn to dusk, keeping the kingdom secure wasn't just a duty, it was survival. Now, if you're picturing the king as some sort of medieval general, constantly riding into battle with his forces, you're only half right. Sure, kings like Henry V or Richard the Lionheart led from the front when it suited them, but their real job was planning the big picture. Take the sheer scale of castle defenses, for example. Castles weren't just picturesque backdrops for regal life. They were the backbone of medieval military strategy. They were built to intimidate, yes, but more importantly, to defend. These fortresses were positioned at key locations, river crossings, borders, or near trade hubs. The king had to ensure they were manned, maintained, and fully stocked. No small feat when maintaining meant hauling in stone, timber, weapons, and food to keep them operational. A poorly defended castle wasn't just vulnerable. It was an invitation for rebellion or invasion. And maintaining those castles wasn't cheap. Skilled laborers, from masons to carpenters, came with high price tags, as did the materials themselves. Just keeping a defensive structure intact during peacetime soaked up a tide of resources. But during wartime, that's when the money really disappeared. Every drawbridge repaired or arrow loop reinforced chipped away at the kingdom's already overstretched budget. The king knew this wasn't optional. Castles weren't an indulgence. They were the only thing standing between his realm and an enemy's ambitions. But castles were just the backdrop. Wars aren't fought with stone walls alone. Armies were the other piece of the equation. The king's forces were a patchwork that had to be stitched together with precision. First, there were the feudal levies. These were soldiers provided by the nobility. A part of the feudal system's "you scratch my back, I let you keep your title" agreement. When the king called his banners, the barons were obligated to send a certain number of knights and foot soldiers. Theoretically, this gave the king access to a large military force. The reality? It wasn't always reliable. Some barons dragged their feet or outright refused, especially if they had personal grievances, or worse, alliances with those the king planned to fight. And when the barons couldn't, or wouldn't, supply enough forces, the king turned to mercenaries. Mercenaries were professionals. They fought for pay, and they were good at what they did. The downside? They were expensive, and their loyalty was only as strong as their next paycheck. A mercenary army could turn from asset to liability fast if wages fell behind. The king had to walk a fine line, always keeping enough gold flowing to keep them on his side, literally. Speaking of gold, let's talk about the logistics of paying for war. Campaigns weren't cheap. Armies needed food, weapons, armor, camp supplies, all of which had to be produced, stored, and transported across harsh terrain. Funding these operations meant leaning heavily on taxes, and, well, as we've covered, taxes were a touchy subject. The king couldn't afford to overburden the peasantry, but every campaign drained the treasury faster than it could refill. It wasn't uncommon to sell off royal lands, increase customs duties on imports, or enforce unpopular levies like scutage, which allowed nobles to pay their way out of military service, all to keep the war machine running. The irony of scutage, of course, was that it let the wealthiest avoid fighting, while the poor bore the harshest consequences of conflict. And yet, war wasn't always swords clashing and banners waving. Diplomacy was just as vital, if not more so. A well-negotiated treaty could delay a costly conflict, or even prevent one entirely. Strategic marriages were often the easiest way to broker peace, or at least buy time. A king's daughter might be married off to a rival lord, or his own marriage might cement an alliance. Of course, diplomacy wasn't foolproof. A single broken promise or perceived slight could unravel years of hard-won peace in an instant. Kings had to be as skilled in negotiation as they were on the battlefield, always keeping potential enemies one treaty away from becoming allies, or at least holding off long enough for the treasury to recover. You want an example of medieval military brilliance? Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt. Picture this: 1415, muddy fields in northern France. Henry's forces were outnumbered, weary, and cornered by the French, who thought they'd deliver a swift and glorious victory. Instead, Henry's strategy turned the battlefield into a nightmare for the French. By using the terrain to funnel their massive numbers into a bottleneck and unleashing waves of deadly longbow fire, he turned what looked like certain defeat into a crushing victory. The longbow itself was a weapon the English had mastered, and Henry exploited its power to devastating effect. But here's the thing: that victory didn't just rest on tactics, as sharp as they were. Months of preparation, logistics, supplies, motivation had made it possible. A king with an empty treasury? No Agincourt. But with victories came the steep cost of maintaining the gains. Conquered territory had to be managed, fortified, and defended, often by stretched thin armies and a fragile support system. And when you finally had peace, you never really had peace. Even in quiet times, kings prepared for the next inevitable conflict. Fortifications were improved, alliances were renegotiated, and armies were drilled. Peace in a medieval kingdom wasn't a time to relax, it was a time to build. Because if you waited for war to start preparing, you'd already lost. And let's not forget the personal strain this constant vigilance took on the king. Every decision rested on his shoulders. Declare war too soon, and he'd drain the treasury and alienate his subjects. Wait too long, and an enemy might grow too strong to defeat. Every loss of a castle, every failed campaign, every rebellion reflected directly on him as a ruler. A king's legacy was shaped by war as much as law, and mediocrity in military strategy could doom both the kingdom and the crown. Even in peacetime, the drumbeat of potential conflict never stopped echoing in the background. The medieval king was fighting battles even when no enemy was in sight, balancing power, resources, and alliances with an eye always to the horizon. But war wasn't the king's only concern. He also had to manage the spiritual heart of his kingdom. Let's talk about that next. The church wasn't just a partner for medieval kings, it was a towering rival, with a power almost equal to the throne itself. In a world where faith governed nearly every aspect of daily life, the church's influence sprawled far beyond prayers and sermons. It set laws, controlled education, decided what was moral, and held sway over the souls of the king's subjects. And to make it even more complicated, its sheer wealth made it just as formidable as its spiritual dominance. For a king, Balancing the crown and the cross wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. On paper, the king and the church shared a common goal: the stability of the realm. The church wanted order because chaos disrupted its influence, and the king needed the church's endorsement to legitimize his authority. Coronation ceremonies were a great example of this partnership. They weren't just political theatre, they were spiritual statements. The moment a bishop placed the crown on the king's head and anointed him with holy oil, it wasn't just about claiming power, it was about declaring, "God has chosen me to rule." That divine stamp of approval was worth more than armies. It silenced whispers of rebellion before they started. But here's the thing about power: no one likes to share it. For all the unity shown during coronations, the relationship between the throne and the altar was far from harmonious. The church's authority often bumped up against the king's control. Take laws, for instance. The church operated under its own legal system, canon law, which covered everything from marriage to morality. It wasn't just for priests and monks. It overlapped with the king's laws, creating constant friction. Who had the final say when issues like inheritance or divorce came up? That depended on who won the next argument, and it often wasn't the king. Economic disputes made things even messier. The church controlled massive amounts of land and wealth, rivaling, if not surpassing, the king's. Monasteries didn't just collect donations, they owned farms, mills, and entire villages. Traditionally, these lands were exempt from royal taxes, which, understandably, didn't sit well with the crown. Kings often pushed back, trying to tax the clergy or limit their landholdings. But every attempt risked triggering backlash, not just from monks and bishops, but from the common people who saw the church as their spiritual lifeline. Taxing a farmer was one thing. Taxing his church crossed a line that could lead directly to revolt. The most famous clash between the monarchy and the church is the story of Henry II and Thomas Becket. If this were a play, it would have started as a buddy comedy. Henry, the shrewd and ambitious king, appointing his close friend Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury to keep the church under royal control. But things didn't go as planned. Once in office, Becket turned into a staunch defender of church independence, opposing the king at every turn. The feud escalated dangerously, and in 1170, 4 knights loyal to Henry, misinterpreting his frustrations as orders, marched into Canterbury Cathedral and assassinated Becket. It was a disaster for Henry. Becket's death turned him into a martyr, and the church's outcry was deafening. Henry had to publicly humble himself, walking barefoot to Canterbury and being flogged by monks to prove his penance. The message was clear. However powerful a king thought he was, the church could always bring him to his knees. But kings weren't entirely helpless. They knew how to play the game too. Religion wasn't just a source of tension, it was a tool. Kings used holy relics and symbols to boost their image, reminding everyone that their rule was divinely sanctioned. Pilgrimage sites were often tied to royal interests, and the careful placement of such relics could boost a king's reputation as a pious and rightful ruler. Even works of art or architecture weren't just about grandeur, they were about legacy. A cathedral like Westminster Abbey wasn't only a sacred space, it was a monument, a stamp that said, "The king put his mark here for eternity." The church's involvement in daily life only made things more complex. Priests didn't just lead prayers, they acted as moral watchdogs for almost every aspect of society. Even something like courtship wasn't free from their control. Sermons warned against things like flirtation, and monasteries even opened letters to check for improper behavior. Missing Mass was a sin that could earn someone exclusion from their community, making the church's grip on the people incredibly tight. For a king, this control could work in his favor, reinforcing obedience. But it also gave the church a lever to pull whenever it wanted to challenge the crown. Marriage was another layer of religious and political tension. The church ruled marriage as a sacred bond, which meant that any royal union, often used to forge alliances, required its blessing. If a king wanted a divorce or annulment, it was up to the church to decide whether to grant it. That power created no small amount of drama. Henry VIII might spring to mind here, but disputes over royal marriages and legitimacy haunted many medieval kings, long before he came onto the scene. Such matters weren't just about personal lives. They were about the future of dynasties, heirs, and entire kingdoms. And so, while cooperation between the church and the crown was essential, the balance was never easy to maintain. Losing the church's support wasn't just bad optics. It could destroy a reign. If the Pope excommunicated a king, that ruler not only lost his spiritual authority, but also opened the door to rebellion. Meanwhile, an interdict, essentially placing an entire kingdom under spiritual embargo, meant no church services, no baptisms, no weddings, and no funerals. You can imagine how that would sit with the peasants. When the church pulled its support, it wasn't a nudge, it was an earthquake. The tension came down, as it often did, to control. The king needed the church to keep order, but not too much order. The church needed the king's support to stay influential, but not so much support that they became puppets of the crown. This constant push and pull shaped medieval politics as much as any war or rebellion. The stakes were eternal, quite literally, since kings ruled under the looming promise of judgment, both on earth and in the afterlife. But even with the church's blessings, the king still had to win over his most important subjects, his people. After all, keeping the clergy content didn't guarantee the same for restless villagers on the verge of revolt. That's where the real test of power played out. The ability to navigate the fiery demands of the common folk. To a medieval peasant, the king wasn't just a distant figure wearing gold and jewels. He was a paradox. On one hand, he symbolized hope. He was the benevolent father figure who might pass laws to lower taxes, help after a famine, or stop a local lord from pushing them too far. On the other hand, he was also an unreachable force of oppression. Every tax they paid, every labor they owed, it all came back to him. The king ruled from a throne most peasants would only ever see on coins or hear about through royal proclamations. But his presence hung over every aspect of their lives. And for a king, navigating this delicate balance wasn't optional. If he misjudged the needs, or tempers, of his people, the consequences could burn through the kingdom like wildfire. For most peasants, life was a daily battle for survival. Most of the population lived in poverty, scraping what they could from the lands they didn't even own. The feudal system made sure of that. Peasants owed their lords not just rent, but labor, grain, and sometimes even livestock. They worked dawn to dusk, their backs bent in fields that fed everyone except them. It was the same story year after year, until it wasn't. You see, all it took was a bad harvest or a harsh winter to send entire villages into starvation. When disasters struck, like the plague or a string of failed crops, things could spiral quickly. Families that had just barely been managing couldn't survive another tax collector pounding on the door. And when the king's demands didn't ease up, desperation often turned into fury. The king might be physically miles away, but make no mistake, his policies were deeply felt in those villages. Taxation hit peasants hard. Poll taxes, like the one that sparked the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, were especially hated. This infamous tax didn't care if you were starving or struggling. It demanded the same amount from everyone, from wealthy merchants in London to families barely surviving in the countryside. Predictably, it shattered what little patience the peasants had left. After years of injustices, the poll tax was simply one step too far. The revolt began in Essex and Kent, but it wasn't long before it swept through the kingdom. Led by figures like Wat Tyler, peasants marched on London in an explosive display of anger against the feudal system. They weren't just upset about taxes, though. They wanted bigger changes, an end to serfdom, fairer treatment, freedom from the suffocating rules imposed by the nobility. And let's not forget John Ball, a radical preacher whose sermons inspired rebellion. His words urging equality and accusing the wealthy of hoarding power ignited something bigger than just frustration. This wasn't about a single issue. It was a direct challenge to the system itself, and crucially, to the king's authority. When the rebels reached London, they didn't arrive quietly. They stormed buildings, targeted those they blamed for their suffering, and even beheaded royal officials. It wasn't just chaos, it was civil war in the streets. And while they claimed to act in the king's name, their demands told a different story. They were calling out the monarchy as part of the problem. King Richard II faced an impossible choice. He was just 14 at the time, not exactly an age where you'd want to be dealing with open rebellion. But he had no choice. The kingdom was on fire, and his reputation as a ruler was being forged in real time. Richard met with the rebels at Mile End, offering promises to address their grievances, abolishing serfdom, lowering taxes, granting freedoms. The problem? Those promises weren't exactly sincere. A few days after the initial negotiations, Wat Tyler was killed during another meeting, and the revolt quickly unraveled. The royal forces then swept through the countryside, crushing the rebellion with brutal efficiency. Thousands were executed or targeted as punishment. The tax was repealed, sure, but Richard's repression sent a loud, horrifying message. Challenge the crown, and you'll pay dearly. It's tempting to think of these uprisings as rare events, but the truth is, unrest was always bubbling under the surface. The king constantly had to weigh the demands of his nobles, who often pushed for high taxes or forced labor, with the thin patience of the population. Nobles wanted wealth and stability, and they relied on their peasants to supply it. But overtax a starving population, and you didn't just risk losing crop yields, you risked losing their loyalty entirely. Kings knew this tension couldn't be ignored. Communication became critical, though it wasn't exactly direct. Peasants didn't get sit-downs with the king, but they did hear his proclamations. These were posted publicly, often read aloud in town squares by local officials. They weren't just announcements. They were performances designed to show peasants that the king knew their struggles, even if he didn't truly live them. Royal visits served the same purpose. When a king traveled through a village or attended a public fair, it wasn't just about checking in. It was about showing he existed, that he was present in their lives. Every appearance was carefully staged to remind peasants that their king wasn't an abstract idea, but a living, breathing ruler who upheld their faith in the system. Without these gestures, the disconnect between ruler and ruled could become dangerously wide. What drove peasants to revolt wasn't just hunger or high taxes. It was a lack of faith in the fairness of the system. The feudal world was stacked against them, working endlessly, answering to distant lords, paying for wars they didn't start. Add corruption, such as local officials skimming off the top of taxes or unfairly taking land, and the powder keg was fully loaded. At its core, peasant unrest was about an imbalance of power. They saw lives of unimaginable luxury for lords and clergy, while enduring relentless suffering themselves. For kings, this imbalance was a constant gamble. React too harshly to rebellion, and you destroy trust. Act too leniently, and you risk appearing weak, inviting more unrest. The smartest rulers, if you could call it that, combined the two. They crushed revolts with military force, but sprinkled in small concessions to blunt the anger. It wasn't about solving the larger problems. It was about keeping them from boiling over, at least for a while. History shows, though, that these band-aids couldn't last forever. The issues that fueled unrest stayed. Heavy taxes didn't disappear. The wealth gap didn't close. And for the monarchy, ignoring this growing discontent had devastating long-term consequences. A kingdom that expanded through conquest or trade couldn't sustain itself if its own people were too angry or too oppressed to function. Rebellions might be crushed, but the cracks they revealed in the system only deepened with time. The king's relationship with the common people defined his reign more than any battle or coronation ever could. Stability relied on finding a middle ground, enough strength to suppress rebellion, enough wisdom to avoid sparking it in the first place. But by sunset, no matter how carefully that tightrope was walked, new challenges were on the horizon. Because for medieval kings, even the passing hours carried heavy questions. And as the day wound down, the king still faced one final challenge: his legacy. At the end of the day, when the council chambers emptied, the torches flickered low, and the noise of the court finally faded. The king was left alone. But even in those quieter moments, his mind wasn't resting. He wasn't just thinking about next week's harvest or the latest report from the northern borders. He was thinking about eternity. Every decision he made, every stone he ordered stacked for a castle, every decree written in ink, it all built toward the same goal: legacy. Long after his crown was passed to the next in line, he needed his name and his reign to endure. This wasn't just vanity. Legacy was survival. The way history remembered him could shape how the kingdom functioned for years to come. It influenced loyalty, determined how stable the realm would be after his death, and ultimately protected the dynasty he fought to maintain. The anxiety over legacy wasn't some abstract dream of immortality. It was woven into the day-to-day grind of being king. Every failure risked not just his reputation, but the future stability of his realm. Building monuments, commissioning records, and preparing the next generation weren't self-indulgent pursuits. They were calculated moves in the endless struggle to manage the unpredictable forces of time and memory. One of the clearest ways kings cemented power and shaped their image was through stone and mortar. Structures didn't just house the powerful, they told a story. Think of Edward I, whose castle-building campaign in Wales was a masterclass in architecture as propaganda. Conwy, Caernarfon, and Harlech weren't just defensive fortresses. They were physical declarations of English dominance in lands that didn't welcome it. Conwy loomed over the landscape like a warning: I'm here, and I'm not leaving. Caernarfon, with its unique polygonal towers, mimicked Constantinople, linking Edward's reign to the ancient and enduring world of emperors. These castles weren't just for practical defense. They were designed to intimidate, to inspire awe, and to outlast their builder. But castles were only one tool in the box. Kings also turned to written records to secure their place in history. Take William the Conqueror's Domesday Book, one of the most iconic examples. It wasn't just an administrative tool to figure out who owned what, and more importantly, who owed him taxes. It was also a statement of control. By documenting nearly the entirety of England's wealth and resources, William painted himself as a ruler who left nothing unchecked. This wasn't just governance, it was legacy in numbers, etched into vellum for royal administrators, rebellious lords, and future historians alike to see. William ruled, and he ruled thoroughly. But legacy didn't stop with stone and ink. Kings also turned to the arts and the church. After all, people's souls weren't only swayed by castles or tax records. They were shaped by faith and the spectacle of divine monarchy. Coronation reminded everyone that a king ruled because God said so, and kings worked hard to ensure that connection to the divine remained unbroken. Royal patrons poured resources into monasteries, cathedrals, and on occasion, entire towns, bolstering their spiritual image while reinforcing authority. By aligning themselves so closely with the church, kings effectively said, "Opposing the crown doesn't just make you disloyal, it makes you a sinner." And of course, kings looked beyond theology to solidify their memory. They commissioned portraits, charters, poetry, anything to paint themselves as wise, strong, or destined. These weren't always personal choices. The royal court often employed chroniclers, official record keepers who ensured that today's events would be tomorrow's legend. Such accounts were naturally selective. Chronicles didn't linger on poor policy decisions or failed battles. Instead, they leaned heavily into victories and virtue. Take Richard the Lionheart, whose reputation as a heroic crusader persists despite the fact he spent less actual time in England ruling than almost any other king. Good chronicling can create lasting myths. Of course, nothing gnawed at a king's legacy more than the question of inheritance. Dynasties lived or died by one critical factor: the stability of the succession. Without a clear heir, rival factions emerged, and with them, civil unrest. Kings would go to great lengths to ensure their chosen son was prepared to take the throne, often arranging marriages for political gain or overseeing their upbringing to fit the models of ideal kingship. Doing so wasn't just about passing the torch, it was about securing continuity, preventing wars, and making sure their vision for the kingdom survived their death. But ensuring a smooth succession wasn't always simple. If anything, it was one of the slipperiest pieces of the legacy puzzle. What if there were multiple heirs? What if there weren't any at all? Questions of legitimacy loomed like dark clouds over many royal houses, sparking some of the bloodiest conflicts in medieval history. The Wars of the Roses, which pitted the houses of York and Lancaster against each other, erupted because earlier kings had failed to secure unshakable transitions. For a ruler, the twin goals of securing a legacy and preventing disaster existed in constant tension. Yet, even when the heir was sorted, there was still the issue of how history would interpret everything else. Building stone fortresses and commissioning chronicles weren't guarantees of glory. A ruler's name could be reshaped, sometimes warped, long after they had left the throne. Kings had virtually no control over future authors, shifting political alliances, or even changing cultural values. A once revered ruler could one day be remembered as a tyrant if the wrong historian got their hands on his story. And then there were the legacies that proved more fragile than they first appeared. A castle left behind as a symbol of conquest could fall into ruin centuries later, its original impact reduced to moss-covered rubble. A carefully planned family dynasty could unravel decades after a king's reign, resulting in civil war or outright collapse. The truth was, no matter how elaborate the plan, no ruler could control everything. And yet, none of this stopped them from trying. The anxiety over being forgotten, erased, or misremembered drove kings to push harder, build bigger, and commission louder tributes to their reigns. But despite all their plans, their meticulous records, and monumental undertakings, one undeniable fact remained. No matter how great their victories or how stable their laws, they were still up against time. Stone could crumble, manuscripts could burn, dynasties could fall, but history didn't stop moving. The greatest battle for any king wasn't against enemies, nor was it against the constant upheavals within their own borders. It was against the whispering years, ready to erode their accomplishments into just another name on a long list of rulers. And so, as the candles burned low, the king's day came to an end, but his challenges were far from over. A medieval king's day was a constant struggle to balance power, loyalty, and survival. Every decision, whether it was calming restless barons, managing a volatile economy, or quelling peasant anger, was a calculated risk. The crown may have looked like a symbol of glory, but it carried the weight of an entire kingdom. Alliances to keep, threats to navigate, and a legacy to secure. Next time you imagine wearing a crown, remember, it's not just a symbol of power, it's a lifetime of battles, both seen and unseen. So, would you have lasted a day as a medieval king? Let me know.